In case you're wondering what I'm doing here, this is some kabocha squashes, and I am, these have been in the basement nursery. I'm bringing them up here in the greenhouse, and they're overdue, right? I didn't want them to get this big before I got them in the ground. If you've been talking about the weather, or listening to some of my discussion on the channel, we've had a late wet, cold period, and so these were not ready to be in the ground yet. And so, yeah, I am just now getting them into the greenhouse. I'll keep them in the greenhouse for maybe 1 to 2 weeks while I kind of see what's happening with the weather, and then I'll get them out into the ground as soon as I can there. So what I'm doing at this point is just kind of hydrating them. As you can see, some of these have 2 plants, and I'm going ahead and then sacrificing one in order to give the other one a better chance. And these are about the same to me, so I'm just kind of somewhat arbitrary here that I'm snapping this one out, leaving this one in. Hey, so what I wanted to talk about was how I built these raised beds, the different kinds of raised beds that I have in the garden. I have a couple of different kinds of raised beds in the garden. The original beds here in the main section of the north garden actually predate me. They were here when I moved in about 4 years ago. The boards that were holding them up at the time were breaking down, timbers that were breaking down, and I needed to provide new supports. At the time, I was concerned about using treated lumber, so I went with untreated 2x10s here. They're about 16 feet long, and I put them together. I kept it easy and cheap. There's no genius construction here, just deck screws on the ends holding the 2 pieces together at the corners, and scrap boards that I used to fit the 2 pieces, like a joiner, to get these kind of almost 25-foot long beds. The trellis structure you see on the ends when you look around the garden, that was added about 1.5 years ago from leftover wood from the Mega Potting Bench project. I like the look of these beds and the fact that these boards keep the soil in place. If you followed my videos for a while, you know that we've had problems with rabbits in the last year. These beds are not high enough to keep the rabbits out. Maybe from the ground up, it's about 6 inches high. The issue I ponder is how, if I raise these beds up another 6 inches, what do I do with the existing soil, which I've been building here for years? Is there some way to preserve the usefulness of it? Because what I mean by that is the raised beds, when I just add a new 6 inches, if I just add a bunch of compost on top of what's here, that kind of wastes the soil that's underneath. Because, you know, it's not that helpful to have really good soil that's 2 feet below what you're growing in, is it? I don't think it is. You know, because the growing zone is usually in the top 4 to 6 inches from what I understand. I mean, roots from plants can get deeper than we might think, but generally. So by just raising this up, it feels like I'd be losing the value of what I've already built here. I've been thinking about that, and I was thinking, well, what if I just move the existing soil aside, filled underneath, maybe branches and such, like a hugelkultur type bed, and then put the existing soil on top of it. Of course, doing that would most certainly disturb the soil, but I would be losing, you know, I wouldn't have a no-dig bed at that point because I would have dug it up and moved it around and all that. But yeah, it just seems like it's that might be a good way not to lose some of the organic goodness I built up here. Anyway, back to my wooden sides here. Charles Dowding says that the sides, having sides permanently on his beds would create a habitat for slugs, which is a problem for us here in the Pacific Northwest, just like it's for him in the UK. But I think it's worth dealing with that problem. I mean, I'm going to have slugs anyway, and my paths really do stay pretty tidy in this area, and I like that. Another kind of raised bed that I have that's more kind of that Charles Dowding style, inspired by what I've seen him do, are the beds that I have that are raised up just a little bit above wood chip walking paths in between. And I call those beds the central beds in the north garden. The whole plot is raised up above the surrounding area, but there isn't substantial height difference in the bed versus the wood chip paths. I thought I would get more soil from the beds falling into those paths that way. They would just wash into the wood chip paths, but that actually didn't happen to my pleased surprise. I think because of what I mentioned, there isn't much difference in the height between the bed and the path, so it's not just falling into the path, which is nice. The advantage of those beds is that, you know, they're quicker, they're cheaper, they're easier to set up. I don't have the wood costs and the construction. I didn't have to acquire the lumber or spend any time putting together boxes, and I'm avoiding the slug problem that Charles cautions us about. by doing it that way. The main disadvantage is that the beds are almost the same height as the path, so I'm bending over further to reach the bed. And right now that doesn't make much of a difference because my board-bound beds are only 6 inches tall anyway, so the difference in leaning over is not that much to me. Finally, raising the height of those beds wouldn't work for keeping out rabbits, so that's why I installed a fence around them, and that's one area that I can maybe at least have protected from those critters. The last kind of raised bed is really just a variation of what I showed you in the central plot. Over there in the east kitchen garden, there are asparagus and blackberries over here, and I have raised beds that are essentially cut into what was otherwise a grassy field. I kept the grass and separated the beds from the grass and kept the grass as paths, and I used the gutters that ideally keep a clear neutral zone between the encroaching grass and the beds. These beds are very mounted, sitting higher than the gutters, and I do have problems with the compost falling off the beds into the gutters. And the gutters can get filled up, so I feel like the gutter system, I'm always losing soil every year as I clear them out. But it's just going back into the on-site compost system, so it'll be back in the garden somewhere someday. So it's not all loss. The benefits of those beds, similar to the central plot, they're just easier to set up. I didn't have to buy lumber and create boxes or anything, but those beds do require the most maintenance in dealing with them, trying to keep the grass and the gutter and the bed separated, having grass all around it. It's like a lot of things in the garden. I do it more for the aesthetic than for any real productive purpose. Well, that's a quick overview of what I'm doing with the different kinds of beds here. Hope you found that informative or inspiring. Well, I feel like I'm reaching the end of the line here. You know, it's the now or never point in the garden and the weather. With the warm weather, plants like eggplants, peppers, cucumbers, squashes, and of course tomatoes. As we approach June, we still have nights here dipping below 50 degrees. But if I don't get some of these things out in the ground, there won't be enough lead time before fall. At least that's what I'm afraid of. I see fellow gardeners on Facebook groups essentially doing the same. Everyone's just now going for it in our area. So that's where I'm at. The greenhouse has transitioned all the cool weather plants to the outside, and now inside the greenhouse is full of warm weather stuff. I'll start with tomatoes because between the tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants, I think tomatoes need the least heat of the hot-loving plants, so to speak. So I'll get those tomatoes in the ground, and then I'll be taking the peppers and putting some of those in the ground and keeping some in larger pots in the greenhouse and then moving them outside during the hottest part of the weather this summer. I'm going to do exactly the same thing with the eggplants. So I'm going to put a lot of them in the ground. I'm going to keep some of them, pot some of them up into larger pots, start them in the greenhouse, move them outside when we hit the hottest part of the summer, and then move them back in here. With the squashes, I don't feel like I have much of a choice because I don't really want to grow them in the greenhouse, things like winter squashes and zucchinis and stuff. And last year was actually my first stab at growing cucumbers. And I felt like the greenhouse actually ended up being too hot for them much of the summer. I didn't get much of a cucumber crop until into the fall when it cooled down. So I'm going to try just growing the cucumbers outside this year. Well, lots to do as always around here, so I'm going to get back to it. No seeds this week, and something I wasn't sure if was clear in prior videos. When I say in the ground, I mean seedlings from my personal nursery operation. So I put in lettuce, chard, beets, fennel, kale, broccoli, kohlrabi, and cabbage. By the way, if anyone knows what this beautiful flower is here in the garden, please put it in the comments down below. I planted it and I can't remember what it was. Ugh! My bok choy is bolting. I think I could have probably got this bok choy planted by seed and then in the ground like a month earlier. That would have given me more time before the hot days came in. And that's what you see with the bolting here. The bolting that you see here is the result of just a couple of days in the low 70s. And that's not what I would consider particularly hot. But this illustrates a problem I always have with the very heat-sensitive spring crops around here. Bok choy I found tends to like temperatures in the 60s. Mid 60s would be best, but that's a very narrow range to hit here. I can't get consistent 60-degree weather that doesn't flip back down to the 50s or end up peaking up into the 70s on some days. And this week is a great example. After we had a couple of days in the 70s last week, hence the bolting, this weekend we're in the 50s. And then 3 days from now, we're projected to hit a day at 80 degrees. Many, many years ago, I grew beautiful white stem bok choy that was tall. It was before doing these videos. I had a bed that was full of white stem bok choy, about a foot and a half, maybe even taller. And I've been chasing that result ever since, but I can't get there again. I can't keep them growing long enough before I get this bolting action. Oh well, it appears we're finally headed into some warmer weather here, which is good for some other things in the garden. So I'll be trying this bok choy thing again in the fall garden. Well, as you heard, I'm definitely harvesting bok choy this week because it's bolting. I'm also harvesting spinach and kale, and then some of the usual suspects I've been harvesting the last few weeks: lettuce, spring onions, and still more purple sprouting broccoli. By the way, I would love it if you'd put it in the comments down below any suggested topics, questions, things you might want me to address in future videos. And it would mean the world to me if you like and subscribe. Thanks.